Hi, everyone. Arsalan Arif here with Endpoints News, and it's my pleasure to introduce my guest today, Charles Fisher, AI researcher, founder, and CEO of Unlearn. We're here to discuss how AI will transform the future of medicine. And if you've had a chance to catch some of my sessions with Charles in the past, you know he's not just opinionated about AI, but he brings a wealth of real knowledge to the discussion. Welcome back, Charles.
Thanks, Arsalan. Happy to chat today.
Just a few housekeeping items first for the audience. Please submit your questions as soon as you think of it. As you can see, Charles got a fire going on over there, so we've got a real fireside chat. So it's going to be interactive, and we're live today, and we will be available tomorrow on demand. But for our live viewers today, please get your questions in for Charles, and he will have answers for you as best he can. And now, I want to talk about Charles and Unlearn first before I ask him some questions. The long-term vision at Unlearn is to eliminate trial and error in medicine, I've learned. And I've been following the company and been real interested in the steps they've taken along the way. Earlier this year, I noted with interest they announced a collaboration with Merck KGaA with the hope of accelerating their immunology trials by enabling smaller control arms while maintaining statistical power and regulatory grade results. And then in September, the EMA gave a thumbs up to Unlearn's digital twin tech in phase 2 and 3 trials to use patient-specific prognostic scores to reduce clinical trial sizes. It's the first time a regulatory body has approved a machine learning-based method for reducing sample size in pivotal trials, and I found it really interesting. So Charles, back to the original question we are here to discuss. How will AI transform the future of medicine? And so I want to kick it off with that because this is a highly skeptical claim in biopharma, and it's a field that runs rampant with overzealous marketing and extremely bold claims. So let's just start off by what are actually the hallmarks of an AI-led company?
The hallmarks of an AI-first company.
Yeah.
So there's a whole bunch of companies that a few years ago, really in the tech side, came out as saying that they were going to be AI-first companies. I mean, Google is an example of a company that kind of made that claim. I think around the time that they got acquired DeepMind, right? So they went out, they acquired DeepMind, they were going to be an AI-first company. And so that really is a question of what is your first priority. So if your business's first number one priority is artificial intelligence, then you are an AI-first company. If that is not your number one priority, then you're not. then you're not an AI first company. Like you are an AI second or third, wherever it is the priority on your list, right? So I think that, that's number one. That is the distinction, in my opinion, between AI first and a non-AI first company. And I think you see a lot of typical characteristics of companies that are AI first is that they're investing in building AI for the future. I think the real fundamental sort of driving force that we're seeing in AI these days is just velocity. The progress with which machine learning and AI-based methods are getting better constantly exceeds everyone's predictions of how quickly that will happen. So people say, oh, we won't be able to solve that problem for another 10 years. And 1 year later, somebody solves that problem, right? So it's getting better faster and faster and faster and faster. And so these AI first companies are hiring AI researchers, often have people from that background in leadership positions, and are thinking about how they can leverage that increasing that sort of new Moore's law of AI getting better or whatever every year. I think it's difficult for legacy industry companies to figure out how to do this. This is a classic innovator's dilemma, right? You have a technology that is getting better at an extremely fast rate, but maybe it's not good enough today always to solve your problems right now. So what do? Do you solve your problems right now, ignoring the fact that there's this rapidly increasing technology that is eventually going to solve your problems in the future? Or do you pivot now to having that be a focus of your business? That's classic problem.
Okay, so do you need to be an AI first company in order to take advantage of all the things that AI has to offer a company?
Well, no, I mean, I don't think that you need to be an AI first company to take advantage of things that AI is doing, because we are all taking advantage of AI. Every single person takes advantage of AI advances in daily life all the time. Every time you use your smartphone, there's a bunch of AI that is allowing you to use your smartphone and do things now. I think there's a question of it's not so much like, will you be able to use some of the advances from AI to improve your business? The way I view it is that if you are not an AI first company, then you are not going to take advantage necessarily optimally of this increasing velocity, of this dramatic improvement in this technology over time. And eventually someone else who has that as a higher priority will, right? So eventually you'll lose. like that is kind of the way I think it is. So like today, yeah, absolutely, you can take advantage of AI through various things. But if there is some other company that is a competitor to you that has that as a higher priority, probably 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, they're going to reap a lot more rewards than you are.
Okay. Now, I think a lot of the skepticism from the industry comes from there's a lot of hype to marketing, but there's also this idea that we're trying to model an extremely complex biological construct like a human using technology. So do we really have enough data and knowledge to model a complex biological construct like a human?
It depends what you mean by model a complex biological
Let
construct.
me ask you this. So if we're using an AI model in medicine, right? Let's just go further afield to healthcare and maybe having a doctor making a clinical decision and so if they're using an AI model, right? The AI model looks at certain data points and said, you have Alzheimer's or you have this, and it's making a clinical decision. That can be a life or death thing right there. So do we have enough data to do that kind of work today?
Some problems. Yeah, I mean, it's very problem specific. There are certainly going to be problems where you might want to use an AI system. And one, we maybe don't have the data to do it appropriately and it won't work. Two, maybe the algorithms that people have developed today aren't going to be sufficient to solve that problem. But I think one of the challenges is just because you can't solve that problem with an AI system today doesn't mean you won't be able to solve that problem in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years with a new kind of AI system. I think that's fundamentally the point that when I hear people talk about the hype in this domain, it's well, one, I kind of agree that it's a bunch of marketing nonsense from companies that don't do AI that are marketing their stuff as AI. That's 100% true. But the bigger thing is it's missing this, again, it's missing this improvement in AI that we're seeing in other areas. AI applied to biomedical space is a nascent field. Because you can think about biomedicine as being like 10 or 15 years behind the adoption of any new technology. And that's true with AI. And so we're seeing now in all of these other domains, AI making incredible progress. I mean, in San Francisco, I can 100% go and get in a self-driving taxi and it will drive me around and there's no person sitting behind the wheel at all. Those exist now. And so we are seeing this kind of dramatic improvement in these technologies. But that was a 10-year cycle, right? That was 10 years ago, people started working on building those technologies. And we're at the beginning of that 10-year cycle right now in healthcare. And so today there are absolutely going to be problems where people may try to deploy an AI. We've seen this, right? There was the thing with the medical records, the sepsis prediction, where it was not good and it caused a bunch of problems. Yeah, absolutely, we don't want to see those kinds of things happening, but that doesn't mean that 10 years from now, we're not going to have made huge progress on applying these kinds of new technologies.
So being an AI first company or having AI people lead this, they would be the ones to be able to tell folks at a company, you have enough data for this model, this data is not sufficient. Is that right or not? Or how would you actually go and know that this is a sufficient enough data? Because you said in some of these places, yes, in some places, no. How do you distinguish those?
Experimentally. Yeah, experimentally. I think that one interesting aspect about AI and machine learning that people outside of the field tend not to realize is that, when we look at a lot of areas that are mathematical sciences, when you think about theoretical physics, or you just think about mathematics or these kind of fields, they're theoretical. People like go to the blackboard and they write out theories and things and they predict what will happen in an experiment. You even think about classical statistics is this way. There are papers and they prove all of these theorems about the algorithms that they have. We don't know how these kind of models work. It's just like, there's no theories that tell you if you have this amount of data or that amount of data, you'll get this performance. Like, that's not really how it works. It's an experimental science. So AI is really almost like a branch of experimental mathematics or experimental statistics. So the only way to really know how you're going to perform is to get data, build a model, and then test it. And I think what's really, really important is when people want to get into these questions about how is your model going to perform in some kind of new scenario. That's entirely about how you test the model, like figuring out how to test the model and really validate not only that it worked in just the particular population of patients where you trained it from, but it's going to work in a new place, in a new population, a new setting. That's a really challenging problem. But it's super important if you're deploying models to the real world to make clinical decisions, that you are absolutely, ensuring that all that stuff is done properly.
Right. I have a great question here from the audience, and I want to ask it because I think having proper definitions around all of this stuff is going to be part of the key way of eliminating some of the hype. I'm not going to be able to get rid of all of it, but making sure we're all talking about the same definitions here. And actually, I did a session with Charles a few months ago where we did talk about this and trying to define exactly what these terms mean across a couple of different places. But here's the question from the audience, and I want to read it to you, Charles, and get your reaction. How are you defining AI? A lot of companies call NLP AI, which in my opinion is not true AI. You also need ML and predictive analysis. So how are you defining AI, Charles?
Sure. So there's a whole bunch of different historical definitions of AI. In general, artificial intelligence systems, the goal is for them to be able to operate, to perform tasks without requiring any sort of human oversight. And now there's a lot of different tasks that could be. So you could build like narrow AI systems. So you can have like, we certainly have these things that will like use computer vision, like recognize an object and then like go grab it and like put it on a shelf, or like you have a robot or something that does that in a factory. To like what companies are working on with general intelligence. There's like OpenAI's mission is to like develop general intelligence. This would be something that autonomously does all tasks, right? Like it can do everything. By the way, I find it interesting that people talk about like the medicine problem as being really ambitious and difficult, when there are real companies out there like DeepMind and OpenAI whose mission is to do general intelligence that solves everything, which would include medicine. So they actually have an even more ambitious mandate. And I think that machine learning is one particular area where the goal is to be able to have algorithms that can learn through observation, potentially through interaction with the world as well, running their own experiments. So you have algorithms that can do that without human oversight. So the whole thing here is to be able to have things that can do things, computers operate within the world without human oversight. So to give you an example of like a difference of kind of a different way of thinking about it, people have been doing modeling, predictive modeling for forever, where we would do what machine learning people call feature engineering. And so what that basically means is you're going to look at all of these different measurements that you can collect, say in medicine on a particular person, and you're going to use your human intelligence, the HI, to come up with some particular features that you would want to use. So we might think about measuring specific kinds of biomarkers, right? I mean, a very simple example of this is just body mass index. Like that, this is where body mass index came from, weight divided by height squared. Somebody decided that that was a good feature to use in some sort of predictive algorithm. And so you would have human intelligence, humans actually going and doing all of that kind of stuff. And so the goal of sort of artificial intelligence, and specifically machine learning with the subfield, is to be able to not have to do that. Right? That you collect data, you give the data in its raw form effectively to some sort of computer algorithm, and it's able to figure these things out without having a human having to be there and engineer features and tell it what to look for.
Okay. I want to ask another question here from the audience, because it's going to get into a field that I want to talk about. Is there AI-assisted drug discovery or development in clinical trials now? I'm just going to that's the question, but I'm going to tee it off by saying that we have at Endpoints reported on a couple of these when we have had companies say out that the first AI-generated drug is in trials. So, what's your take on that, Charles? What does it mean to have an AI-assisted drug that's been discovered by AI in trials? What does that even mean?
Well, it could mean a lot of things, is the truth. I don't know necessarily this, but we don't do drug discovery, so I'm not really that involved in the drug discovery kind of piece of it. I do think that it's interesting, and I think that there will be areas there where if AI is not actually really truly contributing to things today, it will contribute a lot in the future. I do think that that's true. So there's a few things that you could think about. For example, just like target discovery. So could you figure out from some particular, I don't know, like cellular measurements of what is going to be a good target for a disease. So there's a bunch of companies that there's different ways you could think about doing that. So you could say like, well, I'm going to collect all of this molecular data. I'm going to go and I'm going to do a bunch of stuff. I'm going to collect RNA sequencing data, proteomics data, collect huge data sets. I'm going to have some sort of algorithms that rather than me putting in what I think the biology is as a researcher, I'm going to have the algorithm tease through that and try to come up with targets. So in my mind, I think of like in silico medicine as a company that I think of as trying to work on that problem. Got other companies who are like, forget this underlying inside the biology thing. Right? What we're going to do is basically phenotypic screening. We're going to take cell line models. We're going to put drugs in them. We're going to not even worry necessarily about like exactly what that drug is doing in the first place. And we're going to use computer vision to automate it. Right? So now you've got sort of these machine learning systems that are kind of automating the computer vision task. So you can run this millions and millions of things. So it's like recursion, right? So you have these different companies that do that kind of stuff, which is sort of related to target discovery, right? One, which would be kind of bottom up, working through the biology, another one which would be top down, right? Then you have companies, working, which I would say on kind of the chemistry side. Once you know the target, can you find a good drug for it? DeepMind is a great example of this with basically solving, people are going to get mad, but like they basically making a giant leap forward on the protein folding problem. Let's put it that way, making a giant leap forward on the protein folding problem, releasing these data sets. Now also Meta just released a similar data set of basically predicted protein structures for like the entire like protein universe. And then there's companies that are trying to use generative modeling to actually generate new kinds of drugs. There's now 1 million generative models that people can work through on images where you could go and find, like you think about DALL-E or Stable Diffusion, where you can generate these artwork images, but you can take that same idea and instead of generating images, you start to generate molecules. And then can you generate molecules with desired properties? So there's a huge area of research in kind of drug discovery, all the way from kind of that target selection through to the chemistry side that is super interesting. Is it ready for prime time in the sense that like there are drugs that were made these way that are in the clinic today? I actually have no idea. Arsalan, you probably follow the field more than I do.
I do.
Yeah.
Well, I do follow it. I'm a very technology positive person. I tend to agree with the whole premise of the webinar along with you that AI will transform healthcare. It just really comes down to the fact that particularly in biopharma, to truly change the curve at biopharma and to really get innovation going, you've got to get better clinical trials. Like you have to have better targets in the clinical trial that has a better chance of working in the clinical trial and becoming a drug. Ultimately, that's where the proof is going to come from who are claiming or actually designing these drugs using those different kind of techniques that you're talking about, top down, bottom down, all that different kind of approaches you were talking about. But I don't think yet we've been able to see, or we have enough candidates out there or enough work out there to actually see that these drugs will be better in clinical trials yet.
Yeah. Yeah, it is certainly the case. I know Recursion just started, they announced a few clinical programs kind of recently. So I know that they have things in the clinic that I assume would have been discovered through this phenotypic screening thing. But like I said, I just don't know enough about it.
Right. And so while we've been talking, we've had several questions and many comments coming in with actual drug names that
Oh,
are
good.
actually in
Yeah,
clinical
people know more.
trials.
Yeah.
that are in clinical trials in the various stages that have been discovered with machine learning and various other sort of stuff. So clearly there's a lot of work going on over here and it's very exciting. But has it translated to better clinical trials? That's what I'm really interested in seeing. So Charles, I know that's something that Unlearn is doing right now. So, and that's really, again, where it comes down to how can we do better clinical trials? How can we have better decisions on what data to collect? How can we enroll a better way of enrolling patients? How can we get more patients enrolled in clinical trials? I think all of those things are the things we truly need to see to really change the paradigm here in biopharma, right? So even on that first one, better ways of doing clinical trials, how can AI help us do better clinical trials?
So there's a lot of ways, and in many ways, AI for clinical trials is a much easier problem. Machine learning for clinical trials is a way easier problem than this machine learning for drug design.
Way easy and biopharma don't go together. So Charles really qualified that statement.
No. It's like it's much more closer to like a straightforward machine learning problem, in a sense,
Okay.
like because you have a lot of data from patients. Like there is an enormous amount of data on natural history of disease, on how patients respond to current standards of care. Like there is constant data coming in on those kind of information, both through, say, just observational studies and registries, but just at point of care. So the data are all there. You think about the difference of saying like, well, how can you take the drug discovery space, you want to have things that like link a chemical structure to a target. How much data do you have that's like that? Not nearly as much as all of the healthcare data that's collected on people on a daily basis, right? So if you think about machine learning as really being like trying to take advantage of these large data sets that we have, well, when we actually think about where we have the largest data sets within healthcare right now, it's on this side of looking at patient data. Now, there are difficulties with that because the data can be unstructured, they can be siloed, they can be noisy. There are certainly difficulties with doing it, but there is a lot of data there. So it turns things into a much sort of more straightforward machine learning problem, right? So like the way that we kind of conceptualize clinical trials in a very overly simplistic way is that a clinical trial is just a comparison, right? You're doing a comparison between some new experimental treatment and some currently available treatment, which might be nothing, right? And then you're saying, well, is this new treatment better or worse in some dimension than what's currently available? And the point about that is that, again, from an AI perspective, we don't have any data probably at all on predicting this new experimental treatment. So that part of the experiment for the time being needs to be run. Right? Like you need to go and you need to give that drug to the new experimental drug to people and see what happens. But there's an enormous amount of data on how patients respond to the current standard of care. And so I think there is a huge opportunity for leveraging AI in a variety of different ways of leveraging AI to incorporate information from that in the trial in different ways, from looking at recruiting patients, better identifying patients who would be, good candidates for the trial, to doing work that we do where we bring in sort of prognostic models and information, sort of computer simulations of the patients into the trial, and leveraging that information to kind of design more efficient trials.
Well, let's double click on that because we have a question from the audience here. Have you been able to extract any important bottlenecks or constraints in clinical trials that were not previously known, aka discovered by the AI? What are they?
Well, what I would say is that we're trying to use AI to solve known bottlenecks. That's kind of the way. It's not like we're looking for like, hey, AI, go like, we've got security cameras looking at the clinical trial and we're asking it to figure out like where the problems are. We know where the problems are, right? Problems. So first of all, the number one problem is not something that we work on, but it's bad target. Bad target is the number one problem that causes drug failures, I think, in clinical trials. That's upstream of what we do. But that's probably the number one. The number two problem is recruitment and enrollment. It's very, very difficult to find patients to actually participate in your trials. And the number three problem is probably adherence, right? So you have kind of these three problems that tend to create difficulties in trials. And so I think that what we should be thinking about, certainly today, and the way that I think about like where AI is actually going to be useful in the next 5 to 10 years is going to be saying like, we identify these problems. We know there's data that we can use. Let's build some sort of narrow AI system to go after solving that problem, as opposed to like one of these general AI systems that solves all problems.
Gotcha. Here we have a question from the audience. I want to actually move downstream a bit because here our topic is all about healthcare and AI transforming healthcare. So let's get your take on this, Charles. Seems like most AI applications are related to R&D activities. Let's comment. What are some of the AI applications suitable at point of care that can affect patient outcomes of commercial therapeutics?
That's a very interesting question. I think that when we think of, there's a big reason. There's a number of whole reasons why AI is focused currently in R&D. And I think why that's at least what I'm talking about. I'm sure that there are other people working on things in point of care. And this ultimately is a question of AI safety. So within the broad sort of sphere of AI research, there's this kind of big umbrella of AI safety. Sometimes people talk about this as like some existential risk of creating a super intelligent AI that like the Terminator takes over the world. And that's not what I mean. I kind of mean the exact opposite of that, which is taking AI algorithms that are not good and deploying them in a way that causes harm. So that is a huge problem. When you move into that R&D space, there are mechanisms to make sure that the algorithms that are being applied don't cause harm. So if you're just like using your AI to analyze images of cells in your experiment, it's not obvious how that is going to cause anybody harm, right? So you're in this kind of space where the use of that model is safe. Even when you get up into the work that we do within clinical trials, we've worked a lot on thinking about how you can deploy these AI algorithms in actually provably safe manner. And this relies on the fact that these are randomized trials. And so when we're working in trials, you have randomization, and you can leverage the randomization process to ensure that even though you're deploying some sort of sophisticated AI model within the trial in some way, the result that you get at the end of the trial, your estimate for the treatment effect is unbiased. So you can actually prove that you don't over or underestimate the treatment effect. So you have kind of these safety guarantees in that R&D space. So now move that forward into the point of care. How do you get safety? If your algorithm makes a terrible recommendation for a particular patient, how do you ensure that it does not cause harm for that patient? I think that's a really interesting area of research, and I think it's challenging, right? The way that people do this today is through human in the loop. And so this is exactly, you looked at all of even kind of still, I mentioned earlier that now there are self-driving cars that have no person in the front seat, that you can take taxis around San Francisco. But that's relatively new. If 2 years ago, you could also there were self-driving cars going around San Francisco, but every single one of them had a driver behind the wheel. Right. And just in case the system tries to, your the person would be there to grab it and pull it back. And that's the way that people currently think about these point of care algorithms for the most part, is that they are tools that help physicians. So, but there is always a physician or some human in the loop that's using the outputs of these models, trying to make sure that they are, again, doing a check. If the model gives you some sort of crazy prediction, the human is there to kind of fix it. I think that there's some other interesting stuff that happens underneath, behind the scenes, that is interesting and helpful, like things for collecting faster medical images, for example. Like, just don't collect as much data. So you say, I'm going to collect a lot less data from this medical image, I'm going to fill it in. That's a really interesting application. I know that there's companies that are working on those things that you kind of, as a patient, you don't really see. But nonetheless, definitely helps you as say, like the hospital, get higher throughput through their like MRI imaging program.
Yep, gotcha. So human in the loop and experimenting, that's probably going to have to be where they're going to have to be a self-driving, actually minder for a bit, you think, before that sort of stuff. There needs to be innovation over there with perhaps a human in the loop, is what you're saying.
Well, I mean, today that's 100% what happens. You have a human in the loop. That's pretty much what happens. I mean, you have other things like AI-based diagnostics, right? And diagnostics always have a human in the loop. In many cases, they've got multiple humans in the loop. Like you'll go to the one doctor and they will review your X-ray, and the other doctor also reviews your X-ray, and you have these kind of checks and balances that kind of happen. Yeah, I think that most of that stuff is that's 100% still where it is at today. And I think that moving in, I think that that's likely to remain that way with a human in the loop on that particular side for a while.
Yeah. I mean, I've got a Tesla and I got the full self-driving. I don't trust it right now. I'm the human in the loop over there, but I mean, I clearly do see how it does, maybe it can work a little wise. So I personally see that. Let's move to another audience question over here. And this question says, successful AI systems in consumer apps rely on efficient, fast, closed loop data pipelines to iterate quickly. What is the current maturity of closed loop data systems in life sciences?
Closed loop data. Yeah, so I mean, there's certainly a lot of things in like advertising analytics where this is kind of certainly the case. We're also looking now at these other kinds of areas where it's not so much like you have like a flywheel effect of creating data, that just you have some big, large data set. And in many cases unsupervised, right? So a huge amount of all of the stuff that we're getting right now that's been big advancements in language modeling, like through GPT-3 and then in the image modeling with DALL-E and all that stuff is what people call self-supervised or unsupervised in a lot of ways. So you have some big data set and you don't actually have necessarily answers. Like it's not like a big label data set that you traditionally had in these kinds of spaces. So the new techniques are actually very, very different. You're using large unlabeled data sets to train kind of this basic model. And then you have a really small data set that you fine tune it to solve some particular problem. And that's like the whole paradigm that's been driving the big progress in machine learning over the last like 2 or 3 years. And that's a very great analogy for a lot of what we have in medicine. There is a lot of data that is out there. In many cases, it won't be directly related to what your task is that you want to solve, but we now have techniques to be able to do that. I think that if you think about other types of that traditional model of trying to create flywheels of data, I don't know. I don't know what people are doing to try to create these sort of data flywheels in these areas. To some degree, Unlearn creates an anti-data flywheel, which is kind of interesting in the sense
Yeah,
of
explain
like,
more.
we use a lot of data from control arms of clinical trials to train models. So when we're building training data sets, we're taking data from control groups of lots and lots of clinical trials. We're also using registries and observational studies and all of these things. But then we're deploying these models in a way that decreases the size of future control groups, right? So in a sense, we're actually decreasing the amount of future data that you get in some way. I think that you're leveraging data from other sources, real-world data, and all of these places, and so you're supplementing it from these other areas. But I think that the future is going to be integration of large data sets in kind of this unsupervised manner, and then fine-tuning on your task, as opposed to trying to build huge labeled data sets on particular narrow tasks.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Now, another question from the audience over here, and this is a broad one, but I want to get your take. Do you think we can crack biological systems using data alone? But the real question is, what is the role of biologists and scientists here?
Future biologists in the future will be computational biologists. I mean, I think that is in the future, everyone is going to be leveraging these kinds of things as part of the work. So in 20 years, you think about, like, in 20 years, everyone who's graduating from a PhD in a biology program is also going to be highly leveraging AI in their particular research, right? And so that's kind of how it always is. The new technologies kind of come and they go through waves of academic generations. Is sort of the way a lot of these things tend to work. So I think that there's a question of where are we at today, right? Because again, a huge amount of it is that those things are definitely going to happen, and there's going to be a wave, really a transition from biology of what people think of as kind of like being a really wet lab and driven science today to, I think, being a much more computationally driven science in 20 years. But today, these kinds of algorithms always require domain knowledge. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can think about domain knowledge as being important. One could be what machine learning people call inductive bias. Inductive bias basically means that, remember this thing I said at the beginning, which is that machine learning means you don't do feature engineering? Well, okay, so then machine learning people replace this with inductive bias, which is sort of like feature engineering. It's usually like more vague and loose than that, but it is basically saying, can you design sort of your model? Can you put some domain knowledge into the way the model actually operates, which is very similar to feature engineering. And that's a real thing that definitely happens. But I think what's more important is data. So somebody has to select the data set that the model is actually going to be trained on in the first place. Somebody needs to figure out if that's going to be trained on experimental data, but what experiments should be run? And I mean interventions, like what intervention should be run? Like if you're trying to do RNA sequencing, should you be like, using CRISPR and knocking out with all of these genes and training on this? So somebody has to design the experiments that the algorithms will use. And that is 100% people who are going to be biologists, right? That to me is, it's almost like the biologist is the teacher and the algorithm is the student. So at Unlearn, we have a team of clinical scientists, for example, and when we are building a training data set for a particular disease, there's actually a couple of things that happen. One is that there's a big just domain knowledge summary that is made for the machine learning. Like, here is what things are important in this disease. Here's what's known about it. Here's all of this stuff. And then we have to integrate all of these sort of data sets from observational studies, from real world data, from trials. Somebody has to decide what's important, what actually should be put into the algorithm from those data and what should be left out. And so we have a team of clinical scientists who do that. And that role is critical because if you put garbage into a machine learning model, you're going to get garbage out of the machine learning model.
So future biologists will all be computational biologists.
Yeah, well, future everybody will be computational, but but yeah, future biologists will be computational. Like the term computational biologist is going to go away.
Okay, the biologists will all be right.
Computer will be a part of your job. Yeah.
Right. Yep. That seemed like that. I want to ask you another question from the audience, which, boy, I don't know what I would do, but I'm going to ask you the question. Suppose your algorithm predicts you should have an operation with high predictive ability, 90% success, and your clinician says maybe 50% success. What would you do, Charles?
Well, I would want to know a lot of information about where that algorithm came from. I'd also want to know a lot. I'd really, want to know my physician well. So I think you'd have to kind of make that call. My view is that if there is an algorithm that is really, really highly validated, that I would probably trust it more than a person. And I view this even when we look at the self-driving cars. And Arslan, you mentioned earlier your FSD on the Tesla. Like, I think that there's an interesting sociological sort of phenomenon that people want the algorithms to be much, much better than a person before they trust the algorithm, because people crash their cars all the time. I mean, road accidents are one of the leading causes of death, right? In the United States, driving is one of the least safe activities that we do on probably the least safe, most dangerous activity that every person does on a daily basis, right? Humans are not that good at it, actually. Humans crash cars constantly. But when we say, oh, well, this one accident happened with a self-driving car, they're not safe. But humans are crashing constantly. So we're applying different levels of performance criteria to the AI systems than we are to a human system. We're saying that the AI system has to be much, much, much better than a human before we're willing to accept it in a lot of circumstances. And so, I think that for me, if we are saying that we have subjected this AI algorithm to that level of scrutiny, to where it's probably much better than a person, then I would probably take the AI's recommendation.
Right. Okay, got you. Yeah, no, on the you make a great point on the FSD on my Tesla. It's because I keep having this thought, boy, if I do get into an accident and I had FSD on, boy, everyone's going to laugh at me, or it just seems like, oh, you just let your Tesla drive and you got into an accident. There's going to be an article written about it. I'm going to look like a fool. And of course, you let your robot drive your car and you didn't drive it yourself. Of course, driving is probably the most dangerous thing I do, maybe except flying some small planes here and there. That's dangerous too. So there that. Let me go. We only have 20 minutes here and we have so many questions from the audience. I want to a couple of regulatory questions because we have so many biopharma people in the audience and they're very curious about this. I have done a session with Charles about this in the past, maybe about a year ago. You can check out Endpoints webinars. I mentioned some EMA progress that Unlearn has had, but here's the question. How does FDA see the inclusion of AI in drug discovery? We talked about that already, but AI in clinical trials. So how does FDA see the inclusion of AI in clinical trials? And what changes on their policies or regulations might AI bring? So maybe you could answer that.
Sure. So most companies who are working on AI things, I mentioned earlier the stuff about AI safety. I said there was another angle on it. It's not our angle. We've really gone and focused a huge amount of our effort on regulatory, right? We do a lot of work. We've gone out of our way to go and get regulatory reviewed when we didn't have to, like that wasn't required, but we decided to go do it. But most companies are choosing problems where they just don't have to interact with the regulators with their AI system, right? So you can say, well, okay, if you're doing drug discovery, right? So you're trying to say, I discover this chemical or this target or whatever with an AI algorithm. The regulators don't care how you discover your chemical. You're going to go and test it in clinical trials like you would any other thing. And so to a sense, the fact that you're an AI-driven biotech, your regulatory risk is exactly the same as any other biotech. There is no difference, right? I think then when you move to the clinical trials, you also have a bunch of companies who are trying to use machine learning AI-based systems to identify patients for trials. And I don't think, I'm not an expert, but I don't think that they have particularly high regulatory burdens either. I think that those companies, like a lot of what they're doing is basically regular AI stuff, ads, I think, right? You're basically trying to target ads at specific people who can then choose to participate in these trials. So you're advertising the trial availability. For us, we put a really big focus on the question of rigor. So like what we wanted to be able to do at Unlearn was to say, okay, you're going to be using some sort of AI system within your clinical trial, right? So in this case, for every single patient who enrolls in the trial, whether they get the treatment or they get the control, we create a prediction of what the potential outcome would be for that patient if they got the control. So that's kind of what we're doing. And then you're incorporating this information, what we call digital twins, of all of the trial participants into the analysis of the trial. And so there's a key question, which is, does this trial still produce rigorous results? If I get a p-value out of that trial, can I interpret it exactly the same as a p-value out of a trial that does not have the AI system? If I get a confidence interval, does it mean the same exact thing? Do I need to believe something about this AI system? Do I need it to be heavily validated? If I can't interpret the trial the same way, if I need to believe some special thing in order to interpret it, then I have decreased trust in that trial outcome. And we can't do that. I mean, we saw this in the pandemic, right? That how important it is to have trust in the outcomes of these clinical trials. So we set out to create a sort of an approach that allows you to do this while providing statistical guarantees on the outcome, on the statistical properties of these trials. Okay. As a result, the way we use these things, these trial designs, fit really neatly into a whole bunch of regulatory frameworks, both from the FDA and from the EMA. With the EMA, we were actually able to go and get them to produce a qualification opinion about whether or not this approach can be applied in phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. And then the FDA has various guidance documents that neatly align with our approach. So there's a bunch of different statistical guidance documents from the FDA. So I don't think that we're going to need to see big regulatory changes out of the FDA or the EMA or other agencies to be able to apply AI to accelerate trials. In fact, I think if we needed that, it would be an enormous problem and barrier to entry. So the way that we've approached the problem is, rather than saying we're going to build something and require FDA to change their standards, we said we're going to need to build the thing to FDA standards. To their standards. We're going to go and make sure that it fits within the current regulatory framework. We don't want to have to build a thing and then convince everybody that it works. We should build a thing that fits to the current standards. So I think that's fundamentally, like, for getting things adopted today, the way that if there's other people working on these kinds of systems, that's the approach to take. Don't ask to change the standards. Work with the current standards and use that as sort of like a requirement sort of for your new product.
Okay. Well, here's a follow-up question from someone in the audience, double clicking on that. How is the prognostic score model in ProCova, and that's your your proprietary model here, related to digital twin model? Was the digital twin model part of the ProCova EMA submission?
Sure. So what we are using to create these digital twins of patients is, what we want to be able to do is create basically a comprehensive probabilistic forecast. So what I would mean by that is that for each different variable that you might, each patient characteristic that you might measure. So these vary from one disease to another, but like in Alzheimer's, where we do some work, you have different characteristics that measure a patient's cognitive status. You have other things like blood tests and lab values that are telling you about sort of general health status. You just have all of these different patient characteristics that you're going to measure. And then we want to be able to forecast what's going to happen to every single one of those characteristics over time. So the goal is to basically get a comprehensive future prediction of what a patient can look like. But because the world has randomness in it, trying to get a very, like, it's exactly this person's weight is going to be 191.3 pounds in 7.5 months. That's probably not a realistic thing that anyone would be able to do. So we want to be able to describe probabilities of those things in the future. So when we are creating these kinds of models, we're using these sort of deep generative models that are going to be able to do this kind of probabilistic predictions in the future that are really highly comprehensive. And then, just like for any clinical trial, you're measuring all of these different characteristics about a patient, and then you tend to collapse a lot of that information for the purpose of the analysis down to something like a primary endpoint. Right. And the same thing that we're doing, basically the same thing. So when we're creating these digital twins that are very comprehensive, have all of the information about the patients, and then this prognostic score, we're collapsing it down into saying we're taking this comprehensive thing and we're using it to build a prediction for just like this particular outcome of this patient. So for each outcome that you're interested in, you get a prediction that's derived from this more comprehensive model. So every patient in our trial, in the trials we work on, we're building these digital twins so that we wanted the researchers to be able to ask any question they would potentially want to ask about a patient. They should be able to ask that from one of these digital twins. That's our goal. Like, there should be no measurement. Like, if you wanted to dig into subgroups, you want to look at components, you want to look at you should be able to look at that in the digital twins too. But then for the purpose of the trial design, right, you're always asking about the primary endpoint. So that gets collapsed into one single number, which is this prognostic score.
I want to ask you, because we have so many questions here from the audience. They're asking a variation of this question, but we have one audience member who's asked it most clearly, and I'm going to ask it to you this way. Charles, what is your biggest challenge and barrier today?
The biggest challenge probably for every single Okay, so I think that there's two. I'm going to cheat, and I said earlier you have to choose the top priority. So this is a very difficult question because I think that there are two things that tend to be big challenges.
Okay.
One is on data, right? And the biggest challenge here is just the siloing of data within the healthcare space. It's something that creates a challenge for us as a company. I think it creates a challenge for everyone in the whole space, that people view, interestingly, patient data as proprietary and not owned by the patient, which I find to be completely bizarre. It seems to me that my data should be owned by me, as opposed to owned by some other company. I find that very, very bizarre. And so the siloing of data within the healthcare space is something that I think is really problematic. I would prefer for data to be open and available to everybody. So even like, us, you might think that like, oh, we are going out, we're doing these partnerships, we're paying people in many cases to access various kinds of data. We do a lot of work, an enormous amount of QC on the data that we get. That's like, any machine learning company will tell you that 80% of their time is spent on data QC, not actually on algorithm design. And that's true for us too, but I would still rather have all of that be in the open. Because if we really why is there not just one big giant national repository of clinical trial data, for example, that is just open? Where like, why is it not that every time the NIH funds a clinical trial, which they constantly do, that the requirement is those data go into a database that every single researcher in the United States has access to? I think that should happen. And that would be way better for the entire medical research community. And I think it's a more ethical way to treat patient data as well. If I volunteer to participate, put myself at risk in a trial, then my data should be maximally used to improve research in the future. So that's one big area. The other one is really just, I'd say, like a cultural tech versus biomedicine mismatch. That's just kind of hard. The language is different. So like the way we describe models, and then we have meetings with biostatisticians, and we have a biostats team, and everyone has saying the same thing but using different words, and so there's a translation that is actually pretty challenging, I think, for a lot of cases. And just the pace. This is maybe not even a tech biotech thing, more as a like for other startups that are operating in the space. Startups want to move really, really fast. In fact, I say internally all the time that in a lot of ways, a startup only has disadvantages, right? It's because you have fewer people, you have less money, you have less influence, less clout, less notoriety than a big company. Right? Like a big company has more money, more people, more notoriety, more resources, more everything. So what is your advantage?
Nimble though, right?
What?
You can be nimble. You can be nimble.
Right. So your only advantage is speed. Your advantage is speed. That's your only advantage. And so as a startup, you are constantly being like, well, our only advantage is speed. We want to be nimble, want to move fast, we want to incorporate information. But then you are interacting with big companies, with regulators who are not moving at that speed, right? So to a degree, there is a mismatch of speed between the kind of startups trying to move fast and the world they're interacting with. That I think is particularly bad within the healthcare space. Like they're particularly different as opposed to like in a consumer market or something like that, where you can iterate really quickly.
So you were just talking about like your meetings you may have with some biostats people and computer people and saying the same thing, but sort of language being different here. So to the audience here, do you have any tips for how to speak to this? How do you overcome that? How do you get those two to talk to each other and use the same language and get on the same team over there? If they're talking about the same thing using different words, how do you as a CEO and startup founder do that, Charles?
I mean, it's hard. I would say that it's hard. It's not like an easy problem. You just have to have people talk to each other. You have to go out and talk to people from a variety of different spaces, so, for us, we want to be talking to obviously clinicians, people who are running trials, understanding their perspective, biostats, understanding their perspective, patient advocates, understanding their perspective in terms of how things are working in trials. So all of those perspectives are really important. You want to be talking all the time. I think then internally, for having these kind of two different teams, Yeah, I mean, you just need to get people to talk to you. You just need to force them to force them to talk to each other and iterate. I think that's another thing. It's very, very common that, we will go into a particular, say, biopharma company, biotech company, and we'll describe what we do in a particular way. And the people will it's like we spoke in a completely different language. And so the next time we're going to go talk to people, we're going to say it differently, right? I do think that it's very important that you make the effort to try to describe the things you're doing in a way your audience will understand, whoever your audience is. And so whether you're in biostats talking to machine learning talking to biostats, or you're in one of these quantitative areas talking to the clinicians, you just need to try to have some empathy for how the other people are going to think, which you're only going to develop by talking to them.
Okay. Well, we only have 4 short minutes. And so I want to ask you my final question, Charles. How can we ever truly eliminate trial and error in medicine? I mean, that's such a bold claim.
It's not nearly as bold as create AGI that does everything and eliminate right? So that's why I said earlier, it's actually not that bold of a claim. I think that people tend to really underestimate the rate of progress that we're going to be making with these kinds of systems over the next 50 to 100 years. I think that it's really, I've said this actually on a previous webinar, 100 years are a really long time. 100 years is super duper long, right? And so when we try to imagine what the world will look like in 100 years from now, you really can't, right? If we went back in time, if we got a time machine, which maybe time machine will exist in 100 years. So imagine a time machine and we could go back 100 years, and you went and you found one of the top biomedical researchers in the world. And you said, what we are doing today is we're going in and we're editing a person's DNA. We're going to go in and find an individual mutation in that person's DNA. And we're going to use this CRISPR system that's going to go in and it's going to edit that one individual mutation, and it's going to fix it, and it's going to cure the disease. They would have no idea what you're talking about because DNA wasn't discovered yet. Right? I mean, you think about how big of a difference that is. Like, so the rate of progress in which things move over that time scale is enormous. So I think that if you're asking like what particular AI technology is going to enable us to completely eliminate trial and error in medicine within the next 100 years, I would say it hasn't been invented yet. It will be invented within the next 100 years, but I think that there's close to a 100% probability it will be invented.
Wow. Okay. Well, you know what? I think I tend to believe you on that one. Using that example over there, you're right. We didn't know about DNA 100 years ago. And with that, thank you so much, Charles Fisher. It's been my pleasure to have you here today. And I love having these chats with you. And thank you so much to Unlearn for sponsoring yet another great session at Endpoints Webinars. If you want to watch this webinar, it will be available on demand soon. And I'm Arslan Arif for Endpoints News. Thanks again, and I'll see you at the next session. Thanks, Charles. Thanks, everybody.